Good evening, Moirav Rabboisai. Ladies and gentlemen, the shir is Leiluy Nishmat, Daniella, Shaina, Aleha Hashalom, Bas Yehoshua, falik sheyichya, and Nishama should have an aliyah, and Allah Yidin Ayashia. As we approach, actually, Shabbos, Mevarchim Kislev, Hashem should bless us all with a good Chodesh and a good month, and a Freilach and Chanukah, which is coming up this month, and only brachas and many simchas, often and soon. We started last week talking about the daughters of light. The course of Shiurim is called Torah has body and soul, where you see the same ideas in Torah being understood on different levels. And I felt like the daughters of light would be another great example of that, where the Torah itself wants the story and the ideas portrayed in the story to be understood on different levels. On a pshat level, on a simple level, we're talking about young women who engage in a terrible aveira of incest. On the other hand, the Gemara itself makes it clear that there was a form of a mitzvah that was taking place here, and the older daughter who does the mitzvah first is rewarded for it. She's rewarded with 4 more generations of Jews and kings that come from her, as opposed to her younger sister, who only did this, so to speak, this mitzvah the following night, one night after that. We also mentioned last week that the Chazal and the Medrash make it clear that there was something unique about the story in the sense of Hashem's involvement, right? I mentioned that the Rashi quotes from the Medrash that Hashem put wine in the cave where Lot and his 2 daughters were, in order to facilitate this. I mentioned that the dot on top of the word in the Torah represents Hashem's presence there as well. And so again, you see in the story how on the Torah, again, the point here is not that one perspective is correct and the other one isn't. That's the opposite of the point. The point is how the Torah itself wants these ideas and stories to be learned on multiple levels. I want to continue along those lines this week. And again, to continue with the story of the 2 daughters of light, and to show how there is more perspectives. You know, the famous expression, Shivim Ponim La Torah, 70 faces to the Torah, 70 facets, 70 angles. So how there is a Kabbalistic and spiritual dimension to this story of light and the 2 daughters and what it portrays and what the Torah wants us to see from it. With one more angle or one more perspective on it, which we'll discuss in Mitzvah Hashem tonight, at least for a couple of minutes. So the way I want to approach this tonight is, I want to start with a pasuk in Megillas Rus. So again, there's Megillas Rus is its own series and set of shiurim, which we learned here in Shul more than once. But of course, you all know the story. The story, for now, all I want, just to highlight the point, that there's a woman called Nomi. She's bereft of her husband. Her husband's name was Elimelech. She's bereft of her 2 sons. Their names were Machlon and Kilyon. She returns back to Eretz Yisrael from the land of Moav with 1 daughter-in-law, whose name, of course, is Rus. When they return, they are poor. They don't have food. They return in shame and in humiliation. The Jewish people who see them return are astounded when they come back. They actually say the words the Jewish people use when they see Nomi come back. Vaterim kol ir, the Torah says that the whole city is in shock, and they say, quote, Hazois Nomi, is this Nomi? Like, what has happened to her? Be it as it may, Nomi and Rus settle in the land of Eretz Yisrael. But again, they're poverty-stricken. They have no food. So in the beginning of Perek Beis, Rus, the Moabite woman, volunteers, takes the initiative, and she tells Nomi that she's going to go to the field. Of course, this is at the time where the Jewish people are harvesting their fields, and she's going to collect different grains of stalk that fall as the reapers are harvesting the field, which halachically, again, it's not for now, through a procedure called leket, is permissible for poor people to collect as these stalks fall. And Rus tells her mother-in-law, Nomi, that she's going to go to the field and she's going to collect these stalks of food, so at least they'll have what to eat. And Nomi gives her blessing and she says, go ahead. Perek Beis, Pasuk Beis. The pasuk describes how Rus goes to collect the food. And the pasuk says, Vatelech, and she went. Vatovoi, and she returned. Vatalaket basoda, and she collected these stalks of grain in the field, acharei hakotzrim, behind the reapers. The Torah goes on to say that it so happened that she ended up in the field of Boaz, who was from the family of Elimelech, and from there, the famous relationship between Rus and Boaz begins. This is how it all started. She goes to collect food for herself and her mother-in-law who have nothing to eat. She goes to collect these fallen stalks as they fall by the reapers who are harvesting them. The Torah says, Vayiker mikra, so to speak. It so happened that she ends up in the field of Boaz, and eventually Boaz notices her, etc. But this pasuk, Vatelech, Vatovoi, Vatalaket Basot, describing the beginning, how it all started, how the whole thing begins, that Rus goes to collect grain from the field, intrigues the commentaries. What's the problem? The problem is that the pasuk is structured in a strange way. Again, I'll read the words, and you'll see exactly what I'm saying. Vatelech, Vatovoi, Vatalaket Basoda acharei hakotzrim. She went, she came back, and she gathered in the field after the reapers, behind the people who were harvesting the field. The commentaries say the pasuk seems to be structured weird. She didn't go, come back, and then gather food. She went, she gathered food, and then she came back. So what's this vatelech, vatovoi, vatalaket basoda acharei hakotzrim? She went, she came back, and she collected food in the field after the reapers. It should have said, she went, she collected food after the reapers, and then she came back. And it so happens that she ended up in the field of Elimelech. The word vatovoi, she returned, seems out of place. The Torah should have said it after describing that she collected the food. She didn't go, come back, and then collect food. She went, collected food, and then came back. Oh, the question is not complicated. It kind of jumps out at you when you read the psukim. All right. Rashi gives a simple and straightforward explanation. Rashi says that before she collected anything from the field, she went back and forth a couple of times. Why? Not because she needed to collect steps on her Fitbit, on her on the app that counts how many steps you took, but Rashi gives a balabata shipshat. Rashi says simple. What happened? Rus was in a foreign land. She'd never been here before. Naomi, her mother-in-law, knew her way around. But Rus volunteered herself to go and collect the food. But Rus doesn't know where she is, and Rus doesn't know where she's going, and Rus doesn't know what in heaven's name is going on. She's figuring this out as she's going along. So Rashi says very famously what happened. She didn't want to get lost. She didn't want to end up in a million different places, and she wanted to go to the same field every day. So what she did was she learned the scope of the land by going and coming back. So she would go, let's say, 100 feet, take a look around, get her bearings, come back, make sure she knew how to return. Then she'd go another 100 feet, or another 50 feet, or another 200 feet, and come back. Vatelech vatovai, so Rashi says, she went and she came back, she went and she came back. She did this again and again until she familiarized herself enough with the surroundings and her sense of direction, so she knew where to go, she knew how to get there, and she knew how to return, and she wouldn't be concerned with getting lost. All right, again, on a practical level, bear in mind that she's aware that she's going to be returning home laden with stalks of grain. She doesn't have a wagon to carry them in. I don't even believe she had necessarily a bag. She'd be holding the whole thing in her hand. She'd be carrying it. So she doesn't want to get lost while she's carrying the heavy load looking for where to go. So she familiarized herself with the ways, with the roads, with the paths, etc., among the fields, which could be confusing, by going and coming back and going and coming back. This is Rashi's explanation, simple, straightforward pshat. Again, to explain why the Torah says that she came back before the Torah says that she collected any food. The Vilna Gaon, the Gra, gives also a very famous explanation on this part of Megillas Rus. The Gra says that Rus was also a very practical but insightful explanation. The Gra says Rus was a wise woman. So she comes to the field, and a very practical woman. So she comes to the field where the reapers have harvested, and there's grain stalks all over the field waiting for people to collect them. So Rus takes a look around, and she realizes, here's what happens. She says she gets to the field and there's lots to collect. So she figures to herself, look what's going to happen. I'm going to walk through the field. As I walk through the field, I'm going to collect grain until I get to the end. By the time I get to the end of the field, I'll be laden, I'll be loaded up. And now I have to walk all the way back in order to go back home, which is what everybody else did. Rus had a better solution. She said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to walk from one end, from the beginning of the field to the end, empty-handed. And I'll collect the stalks of grain as I walk back. As I trace my steps back from the end of the field, back to the beginning of the field, I'll collect all of the grain. This way, by the time I have as much as I can possibly hold, I'll be closer to my point of destination. I'll have to walk less, I'll have to carry less, and also preserve my modesty in a much more efficient way, because I won't have to walk through the field then in the presence of all the other people who are still collecting and working with my hands full, carrying everything that I can carry. So again, another sort of practical balabatish explanation. Vatelech vatovoy, vatelaket pasoda, according to the Gra, means that she went to the end of the field. Vatovoy vatelaket pasoda, she collected the grains in the field as she was making her way back from the end to the beginning, to make her way shorter, to make it faster, to make it more efficient, and to make it less competitive with the others who were collecting in the field. All right, also a sort of pshat, simple, practical explanation, bringing out the wisdom of Naomi. Okay. But those who interpret the Pesukim and the stories on a Kabbalistic level, from a spiritual perspective, they have an absolute field day with this pasuk. What does it mean? Vatelech, she went and she came back and she collected in the field and she ended up in the field of Boaz. Oh boy, do they have a story. Here's what they say is going on. It turns out, you may be familiar, of course, with this, that there's a concept called Gilgul Neshamas. Gilgul Neshamas means, I'm beyond fascinated with this, but Gilgul Neshamas means that in English, we call this reincarnation. It means souls will come back into the world more than once, sometimes many times, over and over again, in order to complete their mission in this world, in order to rectify things that have happened in previous lifetimes. The neshama will come back into this world again. Same soul, different body. It's called Gilgul Neshamas, the reincarnation. Sometimes one neshama will come back many, many times. Of course, the person doesn't remember what happened to them in their previous lifetime because the body is different. But the soul remembers, and the soul has a sense that there's a purpose that there's a mission that is here to accomplish based on things that happened in its previous lifetime, or could be the other way around. Sometimes the neshama has had a particularly powerfully positive experience in the previous lifetime, and therefore the energy that it carries from the previous lifetime propels it and makes it succeed in this lifetime. Open parenthesis. There's a very famous explanation from the Arizal on the words of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, "Harei ani kiven shivim shana." Right? We say it every year in the Pesach Haggadah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, "I'm like a 70-year-old." What does it mean, like a 70-year-old? He wasn't a 70-year-old; he was an 18-year-old. But the Gemara says very famously that he was offered the position of Rosh Yeshiva, and his wife told him, nobody's going to take you seriously if you don't have white hair in your beard, right? Which is why it's very important, if you're in my line of work, to have at least a couple of white hairs in your beard. His wife said, nobody's going to take you seriously. You don't have white hairs in your beard. You're 18 years old. So he went to sleep and he woke up in the morning and he had strands of white hair in his beard, and they appointed him as Rosh Yeshiva. And he said, I'm like a 70-year-old man because he had white hairs in his beard. Says the Ari, all right, all the commentaries talk about it, but the Arizal gave a spiritual explanation. Says the Ari, what's that supposed to mean? He wakes up in the morning, he has strands of white hair in his beard, boom, Rosh Yeshiva, because now people are going to take him seriously as he has white hair in his beard. And if he painted his beard white, that would help. That wasn't his point. His wife's point was, you have no experience. You're an 18-year-old, you're a child. How are you going to be a leader over the Jewish people? How are you going to be the Rosh Yeshiva, the Nasi, you're wet behind the ears. You're a kid. So he goes to sleep, and Hashem makes a miracle, and the white hairs emerge in his beard. Now what? Now he has life experience. How's that going to help? Says the Ari, you don't understand what's going on here. Rabbi Loza ben Azariah was a Gilgal Neshama. He was a reincarnation. Of whom was he a reincarnation? Of Shmuel Hanavi. Why is that so significant? Because Shmuel Hanavi, the Torah says, passed at the age of 52. So 52 years of Shmuel Hanavi, plus the 18 years of Rabbi Loza ben Azariah, gives you 70. So Rabbi Loza ben Azariah wakes up in the morning and he has white hairs in his beard and he says, Harei ani kiven shivim shana. I'm like a 70-year-old. Why is he like a 70-year-old? He's an 18-year-old. He's an 18-year-old kid. Why is he like a 70-year-old man? Because when he saw the white hairs in his beard, he knew, he felt what was manifest was a 70-year-old man. The reincarnation, what he had experienced in his previous lifetime, the tzidkus and the gadlus and the greatness of Shmuel Hanavi was now manifest in him even as an 18-year-old child. So he was able to ascend to this type of position of greatness, even as an 18-year-old, because he had the power of his previous lifetime working through him. He had the power of Shmuel Hanavi, who passed at the age of 52. So he wakes up in the morning and he says, my 18 years plus the 52 years of Shmuel who lived before me, I'm like a 70-year-old man. And off he went and took the reins of leadership. The point I'm making is that this business of Gilgal and Neshamas works in both ways. It works that sometimes we have to rectify what it is that we're missing in previous lifetimes, or sometimes the opposite, experiences that we have in previous lifetimes empower us and give us energy and beyond human power to be able to meet the challenges we have in this lifetime and to accomplish what we need to do, like in the case of Rabbi Loza ben Azariah. Close parenthesis. Let's go back to the story of Rus, who talks about, the Torah says she went and she came back. So the commentaries say, hold on to your heads, the commentaries say, there is a process going on here. Rus was a reincarnation. Of whom? Of whom was Rus a reincarnation? Of the older daughter of Lot. The older daughter of Lot, excuse me, I'm sorry. Rus was a reincarnation. Of whom? Of a woman called Tamar. Hold on to your heads. Rus is a reincarnation of a woman called Tamar. Who's Tamar? Tamar, again, don't want to go through all the details of the story because you all know it. Tamar is the daughter-in-law of Yehuda. Yehuda, the Torah said, had 3 sons. He married the oldest one to a woman called Tamar, but his son died. He married Tamar to a second daughter, and he married a second son to the same woman, Tamar, and the second son died. And he sent Tamar home. He didn't want to marry her to his third son. He was afraid his third son would die, so he sent her off. Tamar disguised herself as a harlot, sat at the crossroads that she knew Yehuda himself, her own father-in-law, was going to travel through. And there, Yehuda meets Tamar. They are intimate. And they actually, from that, she had twins called Peretz and Zorach. The older one, Peretz, the younger one, Zorach. So the Mekubalim, the Kabbalists, say that Rus is a reincarnation of Tamar. Tamar was a reincarnation of Lot's oldest daughter. So it's the same neshama manifest in 3 people. From the oldest daughter of Lot, it goes to Tamar, and from Tamar it goes into Rus. And the men that these 3 marry are also reincarnations of each other. Let's go backwards. So Tamar, so Rus married Boaz. Rus was a reincarnation of Tamar. Boaz was a reincarnation of Yehuda. Tamar and Yehuda are intimate. Tamar is a reincarnation of the older daughter of Lot. Yehuda is a reincarnation of Boaz. So it's 3 generations, it's 3 times the same thing. Lot and his older daughter are reincarnated into Yehuda and Tamar. And they are reincarnated into Rus and Boaz. The same thing 3 times. The same neshama, three generations. This, the Mekubalim say, they teach, is the deeper meaning of the words Vatelech, Vatovoi, Vatelaket, Basoda, Achrei HaKoitzerim, Vayika Mikreo, Chelkas Hasoda LeBoaz. She went, she came back, she gathered in the field behind the reapers, and it so happens that she ended up in the field of Boaz. Say the Mekubalim, say those who interpret the Pesukim and the Torah in a level of spirituality and a level of Kabbalah, they say, how did she end up in the field of Boaz? How did it so happen that Rus punkt, of all the fields, right? Of all the fields, you had to end up in mine. Of all the places she could have ended up in, how does it happen? Punkt, that she ends up in the field of Boaz. You know how? Vatelech vatovai. She went and she came back. What does it mean she went and she came back? She went and she came back refers to the process of Gilgal and Neshamas. She came to the world and she went back. She came back to the world and she left again. And she came back a 3rd time. So she's been through this. She, that is, Rus, the woman, and Boaz, the man, they're now 3rd time around. So their neshamas find each other easily because of their previous lifetimes, their previous experiences. The neshama can sense that they belong together. The neshama feels that attraction. So Rus goes straight to that field. How does she know? Consciously, maybe she didn't know. Maybe she did. But either way, not necessarily. But her neshama feels that she belongs in this particular field. Chelkas hasoda leBoaz. Why? Because she had been through this before. Again and again. At least twice before. Once with Lot and his older daughter. The other time with Yehuda and Tamar. And now again, in the case of Rus and Boaz. I just want to finish with regard to Rus and Boaz, and then we'll go back to the 2 daughters of Lot. With regard to Rus and Boaz, this becomes incredibly important because at the end of the story of Lot, at the end of the story of Rus, Boaz basically asks Rus, what do you want from me? Right? Boaz is 90 years old. Rus is in her 40s, if I remember correctly. And Boaz is basically saying to her, look, what do you want from me? Leave me alone. I'm an old man. And Boaz had suffered also tremendously throughout his life. Terrible. He'd been through terrible things. And Boaz at one point says to Rus, look, you're young, I'm old. Go live your life. What do you want from me? And basically Rus tells Boaz, this is the 3rd time that you're and my neshama are trying to get this thing right. If we don't fix this now, we're going to have to do the whole thing all over again. So will you do me a favor? Let's just sort it out. Get whatever it is that we need to done. Let's do the tikkun and let's be finished with this so we can all move on. Until then, the neshamas are suffering. They're in anguish because they have to finish the shlichus and they'll come back no matter how many times it takes. No matter how many times it takes for the neshama to do this tikkun, the neshama will come back again and again. One of the things, by the way, that every neshama has to do is fulfill all of the mitzvahs. All 613 mitzvahs. Every neshama ultimately needs to fulfill all 613. And if for whatever reason in its lifetime it only fulfills 612, you got to come back. You got to come back. So in the end, Rus will say to Boaz, look, let's finally do this tikkun. And of course they do. And Boaz doesn't live long together with his wife Rus, but they succeeded bringing down the neshama they have to bring down. And from there comes David HaMelech and Shlomo HaMelech, as we learned last week. So this story of Lot and his 2 daughters is not a simple story at all. What was set into motion here continues throughout at least 2 more stages, through 2 more stories, until the shlichus, the neshama, is complete, and the purpose for which they've come into the world is manifest. By the way, Boaz is not just a Gilgal neshama of Yehuda, he's also Yehuda's descendant. Because Yehuda and Tamar have a set of twins called Peretz and Zorach. Peretz is the ancestor of Boaz. It's actually his great-grandfather. And so there you have the whole story playing out. But the commentaries add one more point. There's one more part, there's one more element to this part of the story. If you think about the men in these three stages, Lot, number one, Yehuda, number two, Boaz, number three. If you analyze what goes on in the men, you'll notice that there's three separate levels of consciousness. In the case of the story of Lot, officially the story is Lot was drunk. The Torah says, Lo yoda b'shichva v'kuma. He didn't know what happened at night. He didn't know what happened the next morning, nothing. All right, again, the Torah adds the little dot to tell us that maybe he wasn't as clueless as he pretended to be. But at least officially the story is that he didn't know. In the case of Yehuda and Tamar, Yehuda knows exactly what he's doing, but Yehuda has no idea with whom he's doing it. Yehuda has no idea with whom he's engaging. He's not drunk. He's not in a stupor where he's not responsible for his actions, or he doesn't know what he's doing. He's keenly aware. It's just that he's not aware that the woman is an imposter and she's really somebody else. She's not who she claims she is. So he has pretty good awareness of what's going on, but not complete. He knows what he's doing, but he doesn't know he doesn't know what she's doing. He doesn't know what Tamar is doing. It's only when we get to the third level, Boaz and Rus, where we're finally at a stage where everybody is keenly aware of exactly what's going on and there's no deception happening at all. And again, the idea is this. The idea is that in all of these stages, Lot and his daughters, Yehuda and Tamar, Rus and Boaz, in all of these cases, these are the ancestors of David HaMelech, Shlomo HaMelech, the ones responsible for building the Beis HaMikdash, for all the Jewish kings, Lo Yoso Shevet MiYehuda, of all times, and ultimately even Mashiach himself. And so in all of these processes, in all of these procedures, the commentaries make this clear. Whether the parties involved are fully aware of it, or whether they are not, whether they realize what they're doing or whether they don't realize what they're doing. In the case of the men, in Lot's case, he mamash didn't know. In Yehuda's case, he kind of knew. In the case of Boaz, he did know. In the case of the woman, it's up to interpretation, right? How much did they know? How much did they not know? How much were they sensitive to the fact that there was some kind of shlichus, some kind of mission going on here? Be it as it may, no matter what it is that's happening, no matter how it seems on the surface, behind the scenes, the Rabbanu Shalom is pulling the strings and pushing the buttons to see to it that everything, the course of Jewish history plays itself out perfectly, exactly as it's intended, exactly as it's meant to be. The Kabbalists add another idea. They say that sometimes when a neshama has to come into this world, and the neshama is of extraordinary, superior spiritual quality, this is a neshama that is completely out of the norm, possesses gifts and ability to change the world in a way which is out of the norm and beyond the pale. When a neshama like that has to come into the world, the Mekubalim say, it will very often specifically come into the world through a perverted or incestuous or immoral relationship. The keli, the vessel through which it comes into this world, will sometimes be defiled. And it works that way bedavka. Why? First of all, they say, Hashem created the world in a way where there always has to be a balance of power. There's got to be this equilibrium where good and evil wrestle each other, so to speak, on a relatively level playing field. And so when a neshama like this has to come into the world, the forces of evil argue, make the claim and say, Hashem, if you want to keep things equal, if you want to keep the world a place where there is free choice, you can't let a neshama like this come into this world without anything to hold it back. The forces of good will overtake the forces of evil, halavai, and then there's no more free choice. So it always has to be tempered. It always has to be controlled. It always has to be held back in some way. It's always got to have some kind of challenge. And the greater the neshama is, the more the challenge it must be accompanied with as it comes into this world in order to keep this playing field level. A deeper idea is that a person only truly appreciates something. A person only truly appreciates the greatness, the value of something once they've wrestled through obstacles in order to achieve it. Anything which is handed to us without us having to battle for it, without us having to work for it, is never truly appreciated. So if Hashem were to just release these neshamas into this world, we wouldn't appreciate it. The world wouldn't appreciate it. It wouldn't mean as much. Instead, there always has to be a challenge. It's kind of like whenever you learn Torah, right? Whenever you learn Torah, it's always like a question and an answer. What do you need the question for? Why don't you just give the answer? The answer is, if we just gave the answer, nobody would remember it and nobody would appreciate it. The question helps us appreciate why there's a need for an answer. If there's no question, then why do you need an answer? That's a question. The answer is, the question is there to help us appreciate the value of the answer. So it is with every neshama, with every force or power of good that Hashem puts into this world. There needs to be another negative, difficult power that challenges it. And so the goodness, the power of good is something to overcome. And the greater is the force of good, the more there is a challenge to get in its way so that it needs to overcome. But I think the final and greatest and most important point of this whole discussion, we talk about the daughters of Lot engaged in an incestuous relationship, and from this comes the neshamas of Mashiach, and etc. I think the most important part, the most important idea here is this. It's the Torah's way of telling us that sometimes we ourselves have no idea who we are. Sometimes we ourselves have no idea what kind of potential we possess. And we ourselves have no idea of the infinite power that Hashem has put into us. You know, they say, before a neshama comes into this world, and the neshama is, so to speak, told, the neshama says, listen, you're going to come into this world, and you're going to live a life, please God, 120 years, and this is what you have to accomplish, etc., etc. So when they paint the picture for the neshama of what it has to go through, the neshama says, you know something? No, thank you. I'm not interested. I don't need it. I don't want it. It looks like it's difficult and painful and filled with struggle. And the neshama says, I'm happy here. Why do I need to go through that? The neshama asks before it comes into this world, why do I need to go through that? And one of the answers that are given to the neshama is that until you go through an experience like this, even you, the neshama, have no idea who you are. You have no idea what you can accomplish. You have no idea what you can do. You have no idea the depth of the connection that you have with Hashem. And so all of that amazing stuff sitting inside you is hidden from you and has no manifestation. Of what value is it? Hashem has given you this depth, this infinite source of power, if you're never going to discover it. Unfortunately, the only way for you to discover this is to go down into this world which is fraught with challenge and wrestle it. And there you'll discover. And there you'll discover. All right, this is a simple human fact, but it's also, of course, a Torah fact and a fact of the truth of our people's history. You know, you read the lifespan, the life history of certain people, certain great Jewish leaders. The first one that comes to mind is the Rambam. The kind of life that he lived, the struggles he had in life, the anguish, the suffering that he went through. The Rambam writes in one of his letters, the Rambam writes that at one point he was being supported by his brother. The Rambam had a brother who, if I remember correctly, was a precious stones merchant, and his brother, Rahman al-Islam, died in an accident at sea, drowned together with many assets and many investments. And the Rambam lost his source of income. The Rambam lost his source of support. The Rambam lost his brother, of course. And the Rambam had to deal with his brother's debts. The Rambam writes that when he heard this, when the news came to him that his brother had died and the impact of this on his life, he says he became so weak and so ill, perhaps what we would call today so depressed, that he was bedridden for a year. He couldn't get out of bed for a year. You understand what's going on here? The doctor, the Rambam, who became the doctor of the Sultan and the greatest source of medical genius that the whole world benefited from and still does 800 years later, himself experienced weakness and illness that had him bedridden for a year. He couldn't find a place for himself. Why did he have to go through that? I'm not God. I have no idea. But think about the story. What is it saying? For whatever reason, it was so decreed by Hashem that in order for him to become the Rambam, in order for him to give that type of contribution to the world, he needed to go through that. And so they say every neshama before it comes down to this world cries out to Hashem and says, Hashem, if you love me, why are you doing this to me? And Hashem says, I'll tell you why. Because you have no idea who you are. You need to go on a journey that will teach you about your own sense of self. And the journey is one that's filled with challenge. When you overcome them and you come back, the neshama comes back to heaven. Please God, after it's fulfilled its mission, the neshama then has a sense of the gift that Hashem has given it in terms of its identity and who it is. So it is when we talk about these greatest of souls, David HaMelech and Shlomo HaMelech and all the Jewish kings that came from them. The neshamas come into this world fraught with spiritual challenge. Lot and his older daughter, Yehuda and Tamar. You know, I mean, you all remember the story, but at some point the Torah says they come to Yehuda and they tell Yehuda, Tamar is pregnant. He has no idea that it's from him. He tells them, take her out and give her capital punishment. Tamar lets him know quietly that he's the father. Okay. And their lives are spared. The neshamas are coming into this world. These are individuals, these are Yidden, these are Jews who are going to have an impact that's going to last Jewish history. As they come in, the inborn challenge, the inborn obstacles that they themselves need to overcome in order for them to become who they need to become, comes into the world together with them. It's inborn, that the challenge is born right there. And once they overcome it, no matter how many lifetimes it takes, they emerge to become David HaMelech, Shlomo HaMelech, and ultimately the king, ultimately even Mashiach himself. In other words, what it means is, sometimes we look at ourselves and we tell ourselves, I was born with certain challenges. My nature, my personality, my temperament, right? Once upon a time, they used to call it a wilde chaya. Today they call it ADHD, or be it as it may. Person says, I was born with certain natural challenges. I was born with certain things that I feel like they hold me back. Again, we're not here in the business to justify why Hashem runs the world the way Hashem does. That's up to Hashem. But what we do see here is that when Hashem gives us a challenge, Hashem gives us the strength to overcome it. When God creates an illness in the world, He creates a remedy for that illness. In fact, the remedy comes first. The strength comes first. The neshama comes first. The positive, the light, the ability to overcome always comes before the challenge. And the challenge is only introduced once the neshama has the power to overcome it. Then Hashem says, okay, now we're going to give this neshama the gym, the exercise that it needs in order to bring out its own potential. And so in every step along the way, the greater the neshama is, the more seemingly it comes down, cloaked in darkness and challenge. So that as the neshama comes into consciousness and has to battle through this, the neshama ultimately really discovers who it is. And then the neshama is free. Freedom doesn't mean that we lose the challenges, that they don't exist. Freedom means we understand and we feel, and it's manifest within us, that the things that hold us, the things that in our perception hold us back, were given to us by Hashem to help us become who it is that we need to become. I believe this is the deeper meaning of the piece of Talmud that says that the older daughter of Lot did the mitzvah one night early, and because of that, she merited to have 4 more kings than her younger sister. What does it mean? On a spiritual level, it means it rose to the challenge. The neshama of the older daughter of Lot rose to the challenge faster. It looked around itself and said, if I have these challenges, I must have within myself the ability to overcome them. And as soon as it discovered that, the neshama starts to find its way. So what is it that is my purpose here? As the Jews like to joke, they said, you put an optimist in a room, for 6 months. The only thing that was in the room was schmutz, was dirt from a horse. But he's an optimist. They locked him up in a room with nothing but horse schmutz for 6 months. After 6 months, they opened the door and the optimist is bouncing around the room with boundless energy, tossing around the schmutz like it's gold. And they come to this optimist and they say, are you out of your blessed mind? There's nothing in this room besides for horse schmutz, horse dirt. What are you so excited about? And without a split second hesitation, the optimist goes, if there's so much horse dirt, there's got to be a horse here somewhere. Where did all this dirt come from? A horse must have made it. No, so if a horse made it, I'm looking for the horse. The purpose of these passages and these stories in the Torah is to fill our heart with optimism and life. This means if there's schmutz, if there's dirt, somebody made the dirt. It came from somewhere. A story about Lot and his daughters. Why did Hashem make that happen? Why did Hashem allow that to happen? Why did Hashem put wine in the cave for it to happen? There's a purpose. There's a reason. There's a neshama. There's something that's craving expression. There's a divine purpose for all of existence that's going to come about through this. That's a different story. Does that make the challenge go away? No. But it gives us perspective. We now see this as something, in a sense, a bracha, a blessing, given to us by Hashem, like life itself, a blessing, which is a blessing given to us by Hashem, which challenges us in order for us to become and achieve and bring down into this world the neshamas that we're destined to do with all of their greatness. Have a wonderful Shabbos and a wonderful month. Chodesh Tov, be well.